Welcome everyone to today's webinar in our new series focused on blockchain's ability to address major global challenges. My name is Alex Tapscott. I'm the co-founder of the Blockchain Research Institute and co-author of the book Blockchain Revolution. Today's webinar is titled Consortia and Supply Chain Revolution for the Enterprise. We're very excited to do this webinar today, and this is a very exciting day for us as today we release our newest book, Supply Chain Revolution, to the world. The book is based on the millions of dollars of research that we have conducted here at the Blockchain Research Institute and is a compendium of some of our best research that addresses these very questions. There's a brand new introductory chapter by Don Tapscott, the chairman and co-founder of the BRI. It's available on Amazon and also directly through the publisher, and my colleague Yulia is going to share the link in the chat. This is an interesting time in human history, and I think that's obvious to everyone. We are facing, I think, the greatest challenge of our generation in the threat of COVID-19. It's had a very profound and very negative impact on our world. The economic costs have been devastating. The human costs are unfathomable and not yet over, frankly. And I think it's fair to say that the world will be a very different place when the dust settles from this. So first and foremost, we're very glad that you're able to join us. We hope that you're all safe and healthy, and we hope that you remain that way. Looking at the chat, it seems we have well over 100 folks who have already dialed in and many more to come. I know that there are people from all over the world joining us today. Share where you're from. We'd be curious to find out where everyone's dialing in from. And we're also very pleased to share some news about some of the other products that we have on offer to our general audience. We have a course on INSEAD, which is tackling business use cases for blockchain, government use cases for blockchain. And we just released a new one on financial services. There's plenty in there on supply chains and reinventing our economic infrastructure. And so I encourage you to check that out. We also have a newsletter, which we encourage you to sign up for. And we also plan on hosting our big event in the fall on October 29th and 30th. And we encourage you all to check it out. Yulia will share the links in the chat as well. Wonderful. So as I said, the economic costs of COVID-19 have been devastating on a scale perhaps not seen in modern times. And we think this is a rare turning point in history. The pandemic is going to change our economy, our behavior, and our society. It's clear to me at this point that some leaders who failed this test are going to lose their jobs, and some governments that failed their people are going to lose their power. And many institutions will come under scrutiny and we hope change for the better. The Blockchain Research Institute's mission is to help realize the new promise of the digital economy. It's a new promise because we're in a new second era of the digital age, where technologies like AI, IoT, augmented and virtual reality, biotech, and above all, blockchain, are providing leaders with unprecedented sets of opportunities. The pandemic itself has also revealed structural inadequacies in our health systems, but also in our supply chains. Everywhere, systems based on decades-old technologies have caused severe shortages in protective equipment, from masks and gloves to ventilators. Driven by fear and lack of transparency in supply chains, consumers have panicked, emptying shelves of staples like toilet paper, which is odd and we hope would have been avoided if people had had a little bit more confidence in the ability of stores and the supply chain to meet the demand. While exposing a failure of institutions and leadership, the pandemic, we think, also revealed some serious deficiencies in our systems for innovation, commerce, data governance, and technology infrastructure. Now we believe it is as good a time as any to understand these, not just to help avoid pandemics in the future, but to help us move through this crisis, which will surely continue for some time. Some questions that we hope to answer on this webinar, and I promise this introduction is almost done. How can we increase the reliability of our supply chains and of our logistics, transport, and payment systems? How can we better ensure the authenticity and provenance of medical products and medications, as well as the credentials and readiness of medical personnel? How can we build better transparency in the systems to help rebuild consumer trust in our supply chains? And what is the role for blockchain in all of this? And finally, of course, how do we achieve all this? Can companies go at it alone, or do they need to collaborate with others? And that is why we're very grateful and excited today to be joined by two of the leading experts on these complex issues. So first, I'd like to introduce Hanu Rao. So Hanu Rao is the Global Head of Technology and Partnerships for the TCS blockchain unit. Prior to this, he was part of the team that established TCS's strategic relationship with the MIT Media Lab. And between 2011 and 2015, he was a core member of the Vivacious TCS program, responsible for reimagining and architecting internal digital platforms of the future at TCS. During his IT career, which spanned over 30 plus years, he's held various IT and management roles, from developer to global relationships head and chief architect. He is a futurist at heart. He is a prolific blogger on the TCS internal enterprise collaboration platform, covering a range of topics, industries, technology trends, and their implications. He has a master's degree in technology from IIT in Kharagpur. Our other panelist today is Elisa DiCaprio, who's the head of trade and supply chain for R3. So Elisa is the head of trade for supply chain for R3. She's based in New York City. In addition to strategy, she also covers trade governance and global standards initiatives. She joined from the Asian Development Bank, where she was a senior economist working on digital trade, trade finance, and innovation. She has also worked in both the public and private sectors on export promotion, trade negotiation, and labor issues. She co-chairs the BAFT Innovation Council and chairs the FinTech Working Group for the U.S. Department of Commerce's Trade Finance Advisory Council. She's also co-chair of the ICC Digital Standards Working Group Engagement Committee. She has worked in Cambodia, Chile, Finland, Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, and the US. Her PhD is from MIT, and she holds a BA and an MA from Johns Hopkins University. I bet you there are a lot of people dialing in on this call who live in the places where you've worked, and maybe some who haven't. So we're delighted here to have this big global audience, two expert panelists. So let's get started. Elisa, I'd like to start with you. Let's talk a little bit about your role at R3. Anybody who is on this chat probably thinks of R3 as something that's more focused on financial markets than on global trade. But that's not necessarily true. Can you tell us a little bit about how, what your role is and how it fits into the greater context?
Sure. So it's true. R3 started as a consortium of banks, which is why a lot of people have that thought. But the reason that I joined R3 was actually to build out the work in supply chain and expand it beyond the financial sector. And so that has it happened fairly quickly because when R3 began building different applications for our banks, the banks are always going to pilot with the corporate. And so the corporates would come to us and kind of say, okay, well, what else do you have? And we'd say, okay, well, look, we can build, Corda is a blockchain, you can build anything on top of it. And so we started out with the more regulated sectors, aviation, automotive, where they face the same kind of constraints that a bank would face. And then we expanded out very quickly because what ends up happening and what you see in blockchain is the importance today is not so much about public versus private. It's more about how does it integrate into your existing systems? How does it integrate with IoT? The sort of what we had before not really focused on, but the linkages with other technologies.
So let's talk about that, if you don't mind digging in a bit deeper. What are some of the challenges of dealing with companies that are today using existing systems and trying to layer on top or add to it something that ultimately is very different in its architecture and what it does? What's that experience been like for you?
Well, I think the main thing to keep in mind is that blockchain shouldn't be replacing your entire internal systems, especially right now. It's a relatively new technology, right? You take it, you use it for one very specific thing. And then you get used to it, your team gets used to it, and then you can build out around that. So that's really where we see it happening in supply chain. You're not replacing the entire inventory management system. You're replacing a part of it. And potentially you're mirroring on that as you're testing it. So there really is this sort of more gradual ramp than I think people really expect.
Okay. Hanu, TCS is one of the largest IT services, professional services companies in the world. I'm not sure there's a company that doesn't do business with you, honestly. So you're exposed to dozens of industries, hundreds or thousands of companies. Where are you seeing some of the most promising use cases through the TCS blockchain unit that you run? Where are you seeing some of the most promising use cases with your customers today?
No, in fact, interestingly, blockchain is such a fundamental building block with all the, the strengths, that it has. There is no single industry where we have not seen interest. You would think that, there are certain industries that are probably more predisposed to the blockchain than the others. But believe it or not, we are seeing it everywhere, including, insurance and manufacturing and BFS and entertainment and hospitality. We have seen the interest across the board.
At the beginning, I pointed out a few different technologies that are part of this second era of the digital age. How important is blockchain relative to, say, AI or IoT as they relate to supply chains? Because those two seem awfully important as well.
In fact, we see this as a, the combinatorial effect that each one of the technologies bring. And I don't think it is one or the other, or one versus the other, or one is more important than the other. And as we look at, various use cases, in fact, let me step back. Recently there is one large platform that, that we have built, and then we are looking at this implementation. I looked at, in this overall implementation scenario, how many tools and technologies that we are using in that particular space. When I counted, there were about 35 technology elements in the end-to-end solution space that cuts across all technologies. That includes AI, it includes IoT, it includes the blockchain. And blockchain, of course, is providing the fundamental trust building block and the anchor for the whole system. But there are about 35 technology elements in it. So it's, it is everything working together. If I look at any production scale system, it is going to be, all these technologies working together. That goes back to, what, the answer that was given to the previous question, that blockchain is not going to replace the existing technologies, but it is going to coexist and strengthen the existing solutions because of the trust elements that, strengths that it has.
So you used an expression there, which people may have heard before, a trust anchor. So can you elaborate a little bit more on that? What is the trust anchor as it relates to supply chains? What is blockchain doing there?
If you look at, so number one, blockchain is a ecosystem technology, right? And number two, so that means you're looking at the business processes that is cutting across the organizational boundaries. So that means various organizations are coming together and solving a problem together. And all these organizations are looking at the same data and applying the same set of rules that they have agreed upon. And then, so the moment they're looking at the same data and doing the same processing on all of them, they should get the same results, which is completely different from everybody in the current world. Everybody has their own view of the world. They do their own processing and they get a result, but then they have to verify that they're getting the same results or not. So reconciliations happen. It is often said that about 70% of the workloads in a data center are because of the reconciliations. You are looking at your view of the world and then you are verifying with the others whether their view of the world is the same or not. Blockchain eliminates all of that because you are looking at the same data. It is for the processing that you're doing through the blockchain. You're looking at the same data and then you're doing the same processing, getting the same results. And as a result, that in fact increases the trust in the system because you don't need to cross-verify the others. It's built into the protocol itself.
That's very interesting. this is a question I'm going to ask to both of you, but Elisa, Hanu mentioned that blockchain is an ecosystem technology cutting across many organizations, which I think is one of the sort of driving ethoses of R3, which is that you need to have lots of different companies in related industries as part of the same network and using similar technology. Because if everyone's going their own way, then it is no longer as effective. And we have a member at the BRI who puts it this way, which he says blockchain is basically a team sport. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think what you see with blockchain is there's been this movement from the movement in the line that used to exist between competition and cooperation.
Yeah.
So it used to be, here's my company, those are all my competitors. But with blockchain, if you really want it to work with the full functionality, it needs to be innovation at a sector sort of level rather than an individual company level. I mean, you can do it at an individual company level, but it's just so much more effective and it has so much more benefit and the gains that you can capture if it's done at the sector level. So what we've seen is this kind of rise of consortium, which is, before your competitors, you would try to have a better technology than they would, but now you want to use the same technology, potentially in different ways for different things, but you do want to have this standard to enable assets to sort of transfer across them. So yeah, I very much do think that there's been this shift over time as a result of blockchain.
So I think that the thing that people associate with blockchain the most, rightly or wrongly, are crypto assets, cryptocurrencies. And, I think that there are elements of crypto economics, of tokenization, which actually are really well suited to the enterprise. We don't always have to be talking about buying and selling and trading financial assets and contracts. We can be talking about physical goods and these being digital representations. So how much does that factor into the design of Corda? And I ask that because of its origins, as you pointed out, as a financial services focused project initially. Is this, I'm just trying to think of a way to explain this to people who are on the call today. Are you tokenizing physical assets and using a blockchain as a way to track how they move throughout a supply chain? How does that work exactly?
Okay, so you bring up a good point. When Corda was built, and maybe I'll take like a little bit of a step back, if I may. Originally, R3 was a company that was built. We were basically a consulting company. We were building on different blockchains for a bunch of banks. And when it got to the point of deployment, we realized that, in fact, building on public blockchains didn't work particularly well for highly regulated institutions. With this public blockchain cryptocurrency kind of thing that you're talking about, where every node has the entire blockchain history that available to it. Sometimes that's not really okay, particularly when you're talking about regulated industries, confidential information. A bank is not going to do business. Airbus is not going to do business with a company they can't verify. And so that was kind of the rise of enterprise blockchain. And that's why we created Corda to be able to do those things. But Corda does take the sort of best parts of the Bitcoin blockchain and integrate that in the unspent transactions model, for example, tokenization. I mean, there's a lot of cool things you can do with tokenization, right? I mean, you can break up assets in different ways, and it's just very cool. The difficulty in supply chain, and this is actually broadly to every blockchain, is how do you link the physical asset with the digital representation? That's where the IoT comes in and things like that, but it's not like done particularly well. It's easy to do if you're talking about maybe a diamond or something where you can, etch it or have something indelible that it doesn't change. But if you're talking about like a pallet of pineapples or lettuce, hard to say that digital representation is always the same as the physical representation.
Well, that strikes me as one of the big challenges. You pointed out diamonds. There's a company, Everledger, which uses an interesting sort of multi-factor way of proving what a diamond is. Every diamond is unique, cut, clarity, color, quality, and so forth. But a barrel of oil and a pallet of pineapples are pretty interchangeable, right? I guess where I see that the tokenization holding a lot of promise most obviously is in financial assets, where basically, you know, a stock or a bond is a contract that entitles the bearer to, you know, share of a common enterprise, or it's an obligation for a company to repay a loan or whatever. Those things are easy to tokenize, and physical goods are a bit more difficult. Hanu, do you have any thoughts on overcoming that? You mentioned earlier about the convergence of different technology like IoT and blockchain. This strikes me as one of those prime examples.
In fact, you know, I would probably, you know, think of it in two different ways. Number one, almost anything and everything can be quote unquote tokenized. So, for example, you know, your airline, you know, let's say your airline points. You have a loyalty points with your airlines.
Yeah.
Can I tokenize them and then use it for multiple purposes? Absolutely, yes, because, you know, it's already, you know, it's a digital representation of your loyalty to the airlines. So I can tokenize it. I can go and buy, you know, if I set up a cross-industry network ecosystem, and then where, let's say, Starbucks and let's say American Airlines are coming together, I can take my American Airlines airline points and go to Starbucks and buy a coffee. Or I can go to Starbucks, buy a coffee and get airline points if those business relationships are set up. So that's number one. And number two, for example, you know, hotel rooms, I can take the excess inventory. And then right now, because, you know, the buying and selling is done by the hotel rooms are done by the large players. In fact, I can enable individual investors to invest in excess hotel rooms by taking a hotel room inventory of hotel rooms, tokenize it, and then have individual investors buy and sell them. So I can take a physical goods like, you know, hotel room, and then I can tokenize it. So that's one aspect. Then the second aspect is, I would argue that any system that is driven by the current technology, IT systems, are inherently tokenized, right? You know, because in any case, let's say land records, I would say that they're tokenized because, you know, ultimately you go and see the land, but all the transactions that you do is on the paper using the underlying IT systems of insurance companies and real estate companies and the others. So I would say that anything in the world can be tokenized. To some extent, they're already tokenized.
So let me challenge you on that just a second. So, you know, if I buy a home here in the city of Toronto, I have a lawyer who prepares the materials, the deed gets transferred to the home, and then the materials go into a physical database and occasionally into a digital database, but there's always a physical sort of facsimile just in case something happens. How is that tokenized? I'm not sure I understand what you mean by these assets which run on these really analog systems, some paper-based systems being tokenized, versus say the token representing the contract itself, the deed to the home, and it moving from one custodian, the owner today, to the new custodian or the new owner, me, in the future. What do you mean by that exactly?
So what I mean by that is, you know, I have a home that I want to buy and sell. So right now, the way I buy and sell, and I go and see the house, and then after that, you know, then I deal with let's say, no, it's an existing home, let's say. I go and deal with the seller. I go and see the house to my real estate agent. Now the buyer and seller, they come together, and, you know, a whole lot of paper is exchanged.
Yeah.
And with the way the buyer's agent and the seller's agent and my insurance company, their insurance company, my financing companies, everybody come together. There's a whole lot of paperwork that's involved that is floating right now. But underlying to all of that, you know, there are some different IT systems that are in silos that are kind of talking to each other, exchanging information with each other. Now, what I can do is I can take this house, all this flow of information, I can put a blockchain layer on top, which provides an element of trust and traceability and immutability to all these records, and make this experience as frictionless as possible. How do I do that? Then I need some kind of representation of this house that is getting transferred across all these different siloed systems on a blockchain backbone. the fundamental elements of that, that land has a land record that's in the government database. So I would say that that's a variant of a token. Now I standardize that and then have all this information flow on a blockchain. What it means is then on the blockchain, I have a pseudo electronic representation, which I'm, broadly calling it as a token.
Okay, I think that makes more sense. You mentioned a couple times that this goes on to a blockchain or the blockchain. In Elisa's case, R3 has Corda, which is its own technology. And it also has these consortias in different industries trying to get them to use that technology. What about TCS? I mean, are you building technology solutions? Are you building your own blockchain, or are you providing consulting and professional services to people who want to build on other blockchains? Are you a competitor to R3, or could you be a partner in that regard?
We are definitely a partner. We are definitely not a competitor. When I look at the world of blockchain, you have, number one, you have platforms, what I call the protocol platforms. Protocol platforms are, the R3's Coda, Hyperledger Fabric, Hyperledger Sawtooth. So last time I counted, there are more than 100 such platforms.
Yeah.
But there are about 10 of them that have some that have a play in the enterprise world. We are not building those protocol platforms. We build application level platforms and solutions on top of this protocol platforms. And essentially we solve the business problems of the customers with a variety of solutions. Usually it is when our business unit is involved when I look at the end-to-end solution, there is a blockchain component to that, which is providing the anchor. We are building that solution on top of the platforms like R3's Coda. So
are you at this point technology agnostic? Is it Hyperledger, R3, Ethereum, Cosmos, whatever? Are all these things equal in your mind, or are there certain platforms that have design features and functionality that makes them better suited to your customers? Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah. So there are, when I look at, all the things that we do in our business unit, there are services side of our business, and then there is a platform and solution side to our business unit, apart from research and innovation and the others. On the services side of our business, we are platform agnostic. We look at in some cases, the customers have already decided on a platform. They're probably using, R3 Coda, and they may be using something else. And then for that customer that have already standardized, we work on the platforms that they have already selected and create the solutions. But on the platform side of our business, where we are creating, when I say platforms, I mean the application level platforms that we build on top of protocol platforms. For those application level solutions that we are creating and products that we are creating, we have standardized on just a few select platforms. And R3's Coda is one of the main ones on which we are building a lot of our application platforms.
Yeah, if I could also sort of add to that.
Yeah.
I think the one difference is that R3 is just a platform company. We don't actually build applications. All we do is we make sure that the blockchain works and it continues to work and it has the features that it needs to have. TCS, on the other hand, has all kinds of technological expertise, right? They can do artificial intelligence, IoT, all kinds of different blockchains, hopefully mostly Corda, but also other ones. And so that's why this partnership works well, because there is no competition in that space.
I see. And so this was not a setup for you to talk about the fact that you're partnering with each other, but just to dig a little bit deeper. Sorry, TCS, is TCS then just another member of the consortia, or is it is it a partner that's delivering value for those consortia members? Like, how does that relationship work exactly?
Well, I mean, it's not really a consortium model that we follow anymore anyway. I mean, we're sort of moving towards a much different model as the space changes. So, really what we do as a platform is any company, from startup to, global systems integrator that's building on Corda, we support them. We support them in different ways. We have different kinds of, agreements with them. But, our goal is that to make Corda successful where they apply it. So to his point, different blockchains do different things. You're going to want to use public blockchains for certain use cases that, private permission blockchain would be completely inappropriate for.
Right.
And so, our goal is always just to make it successful where it's applied and to make sure that like our partners are actually using it where it will be successful, because it reflects badly on both of us if it doesn't work. So we don't want to put it in inappropriate use cases.
I see.
And if I can add something to that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, if I can add something to that. So as far as we are concerned, Coda and Coda Enterprise have some very unique strengths, especially when we look at the enterprise world. So that's the reason why, because of its unique strengths, there are some use cases, application solutions, and application level platforms that we believe Coda is uniquely suited for those applications. That is the that belief and that conviction is what has led us to strike a very strategic partnership with Coda and development of various solutions on the platform.
That's great. So we've talked a lot about opportunities. Let's talk about some of the challenges, implementation challenges. Maybe in implementing the technology itself, but also what kind of resistance you see from companies who are used to doing business in a certain way, and you're asking them to, I know it's not replace, but at least to take on technology, which is still relatively new. Elisa, do you want to take the first shot at that one?
Sure. Well, first, I think resistance is a lot lower now. Following March 11th or whenever the pandemic was declared, everybody went digital, right? Emergency rapid response measures were digital. And so now there's no company that's not looking at how do I make digital, how do I have a digital strategy that's more effective? Blockchain connects networks. It doesn't like really replace things. And so because it connects networks, that's a relatively attractive neutral technology that a lot of companies are looking at. I think in terms of, I think the resistance will be less. In addition, now regulators are like, okay, tell us what we were doing wrong and let's try to fix it. So for example, in the United States, you can't have electronic negotiable instruments. They have to be paper-based. They're just defined by the regulation as being on paper with a physical signature, which you can't have on blockchain. But now the regulators are recognizing these things and actually moving to change them. So I think a lot of those barriers are removed. In terms of trade, since that's largely what I work on is the cross-border component of it, what's interesting is if you actually look at what's been implemented, it's kind of different from the vision. So the vision is always, okay, cross-border trade, we're going to include, everything from, the mine all the way to, the car. But in fact, if you look at the first stage of deployments, they tend to be domestic and they tend to be internal to the company. So they're not, the goal is to be, B2B or to be cross-border, but it doesn't start there. And I think that's a more realistic vision of what blockchain can do. You need to start small. You need to start in a way that is not going to be super disruptive, that you can learn with, and then you can expand. You can have the right path. You can prioritize carefully. And that's really what we've seen with a lot of our partners. And I think that's a really smart way to be doing this.
You raised a framework there, which I'd like to ask Hanu about. So in terms of implementation challenges, you've got the technology itself. Is it ready to be deployed? There's industry challenges. Are companies resistant to change, or are they too entrenched? And then there's these, what you pointed out were regulatory challenges, which is that there may be rules that basically preclude the use of the technology or may slow its growth in some way, right? Hanu, what of those three things strikes you as the biggest implementation challenge to adoption today?
In fact, I would say that it's the the mindset is one, and then there are some specific technology related challenges. Let me elaborate. when I look at the technology-related challenges, it's not about the readiness of the technology or newness of the technology. I would say that, the technology has been in existence now, nearly more than 10 years now. And, it is actually driving so to speak, an alternate financial system, quite successfully. So technology is not new and the application is not new. So it is proven. However, where the technology challenges come in is that, but if you look at the other existing technologies, like, databases and the file storage systems and point-to-point communication systems and all those protocols, they have been in existence for longer. And there are people with those deep skills in those areas. And so often the discussion comes, what is the strength? Why should I use? Is the blockchain the appropriate technology? Why can't I use a centralized database-based system, right? That, interestingly, that's one set of discussions that we often have with the technology folks. We used to have more in the past. They have lessened now because more people are convinced about the strengths of blockchain for which it is suited for. But some of those challenges still exist on the technology front. Mind you, right, to repeat, I'm not saying that the blockchain is is it new? It is not new at all. It is proven. So there's no doubt about it. Now, what about the mindset related? So typically we are used to creating, when enterprises are used to creating their own systems, have their own view of the data, their own applications, process everything, expose only a little to the outside world, that is to the other companies, that is required for the reconciling the views of the world with each other. What blockchain brings is an entirely different discipline. You need to have an entirely different way of developing these systems. You need to look at the business processes that are cutting across the organizations. And then you need to create a consortium, at least first you need to create a right use case. And then you need to create a minimum viable ecosystem. And then you need to create a minimum viable product that is solving that, that problem using, some kind of a blockchain based system. So the very fact that it requires a change of working than how you were creating the solutions before, that actually you need to overcome that, that resistance, that, that different way of working, that inertia that it brings in, and the anxiety it brings in, and the change management related aspects. I think those are some of the challenges. Again, as Elisa said, those are reducing, but you still need to overcome some of those.
That's terrific. I want to return to that in a moment, but I also want to allow people who have been patiently waiting to have their questions answered, because we've got some really good ones that have come through here. So Bridget asked about use cases. So we talked about some of the use cases today in financial assets, cryptocurrencies, and so forth. Hanu, can you, or Elisa, maybe Elisa, you can start off. What are some of the specific things that your members, or your customers, I should say, or your users, maybe even is a better term, are doing today with Corda that you can point to as sort of an example of this technology in action?
Sure. In the supply chain space, I mean, there's so many different industries, and they're all quite different. We've got everything from track and trace of parts, MRO in the case of aviation, parts recycling, as well as sort of regular parts in the automotive sector. A lot of stuff around environmental and social reporting, origin requirements, and I guess, and of course, like plenty of financial use cases. That's particularly important now, talking about paying your small suppliers, getting more visibility deeper into the supply chain. Because right now, if you're an OEM, right, I mean, you've probably got your tier 1 suppliers, maybe the tier 2 suppliers, but beyond that, you probably don't. But with blockchain, you suddenly have the ability to potentially do that. And that's particularly attractive to consumers. And so we see going deeper into the supply chain, both for supply chain finance and just for tracking.
Hanu, do you have any specific use cases you want to point to? Any customers comfortable sharing what they're doing, with you sharing what they're doing?
Yeah, without mentioning the customer names, some of the the work, that we have done for our customers, that include one broadly belongs to one of the areas that, that Elisa mentioned, track and trace. So track and trace of medical devices and the quality and the certifications that these devices go through the supply chain is one of the, systems that we have done for one of our medical device customers that we have put in production. Then the other one is now with the current COVID situation, that is actually pointing out a lot of deficiencies in the existing supply chains and the need to have visibility to some of the items like ventilators and the PPEs, and the need to have a decentralized, ad hoc, decentralized need for suppliers, and the need for bringing in some of the new gen technologies, not so much new gen, but things that are becoming more popular, like 3D printing. So actually we are creating and going to launch a platform that deals with decentralization of suppliers and decentralization of this the tracking of the medical supplies and goods and PPEs and ventilators that we are building and actually on Coda. So that's the second. And then there are, but if I look at the entire supply chain, right, we are talking about a transfer of goods and transfer of documents and the transfer of money. So there are, and each one of those, there are a lot of activities, and we are developing a lot of number of solutions related to trade finance and and the track and trace and then the quality. So it's an exciting field. Yeah.
Well, like one quick thing, what's really interesting about the TCS solution that he was just mentioning about the ventilators is that one thing that we haven't seen before is this ability to make markets more flexible. So like what's happened during COVID is before you would have a supplier of ventilators and a buyer. Buyer is the hospital and you're done. But now you have a supplier, a buyer can be a hospital, and then the hospital doesn't need it anymore and they become the supplier to a different place that needs it.
Right.
Regular systems can't track that way, because once it's been sold, it's done. It's out of your original system. It's into the hospital system. There's no way to actually have a global overview. So blockchain allows you to do that. So it allows this sort of like new market flexibility, which is pretty, I think, as an economist, I find really compelling.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other issue that's popped up during the crisis has been the problem with counterfeit PPE and counterfeit medical devices. And I imagine that, that exists even when you just have one buyer and seller, and then you create this resale market. And I imagine it gets even more complicated with more opportunity for fraud and for misuse and waste. So yeah, I can see why as an economist, you'd be looking at the efficiencies of fixing these kinds of problems. Elisa, there's a question here about trade finance. I just want to make sure I ask it exactly. Are any enterprises running trade finance applications on Corda? How would such applications work?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on what the reader means by trade finance. So we do have, again, R3 doesn't run this, like we're just the platform. Sure. But there's a number of different solutions that are being used in documentary trade, so letters of credit. There's Contour is our largest project, is the largest project built on Corda. There are banks live with that. Marco Polo is an open account kind of supply chain finance solution that has receivables finance as well and payables. So that's kind of the largest one in that space. And then there's a number of others that are either region specific or country specific. But yeah, I would say most global trade banks are live on Corda in some form of trade finance at this point. But to be fair, banks are live on lots of different blockchains. I mean, they're not only building on Corda, I think they should be, but they're building on all of the different blockchains.
Why do you think that is? Is it just they're hedging their bets, or they see that each one has different functionality?
I think because blockchain is relatively new for regulated industries like that. It's partly for learning reasons. It's partly because right now there's not interoperability. It's unclear what the sector will look like. So everybody kind of wants to have a hand in everything and make sure that they're able and their technology units are able to sort of deal with anyone. Because I mean, banks respond to their customers. If the largest customer comes to you and says, "I want this," you will do it. And this is the same discussion we've had with ERP providers, where they're like, if my biggest company comes to me and says, I want integration with Corda, we'll build it. That's fine. So I think that's really what you see in the enterprise space right now, is it's customer driven. And so the sort of largest companies are making sure that they're fluent in all of the blockchains.
And just to add to that, there are a couple of other things also. Even if I look at just the trade finance, the field itself is so vast. There are so many things that can be done related to trade finance on a blockchain technology. If you look at any of the existing trade finance networks, they tackle some specific aspect of the trade finance. So there are lots and lots of white spaces for solution development. And once you develop a solution, then how can, if you look at the existing ecosystem and trade network, why can't they develop it? Because they have their own roadmap. They will probably do it at some point of time. What about the existing needs? So that's where there is a place for many players to develop the solutions. Once you develop that solution, where do you run it? On what blockchain network? Naturally, a new ecosystem, a new network will develop. I think that's just a fact of life. That's how the future is going to be.
Got it. Thank you very much. So there's a few questions on specific kinds of use cases here. Maybe we can do these quickly. Just give us your take on that. So Vladimir asks, what ESG supply chain use cases do you work on? Anything specifically on carbon footprint? And I'll just editorialize this quickly, which is that, at the BRI, we view the current crisis as an opportunity to rethink many things, including how we approach big global problems like climate change. It's orthogonal to supply chains, but these things are related in a sense. Any thoughts on that, Heiner?
Yeah, in fact, if you look at some of the existing even consortia, like for example Mobi, they are looking at developing solutions that are where the sustainability and the green is an integral element to that. And there are in fact some of our group companies are involved in for example responsible sourcing, which looks after various which essentially takes into considerations various factors, also including sustainability and green development and the others. So that whole area, I think, is anything related to sustainability and then green is a wide space where a lot of solutions are possible using technology in general and using blockchain as a backbone.
Well, what I think is also much more interesting about blockchain in the ESG space is there's not any like federal regulations really around it, right? This is a company specific requirement that they would have. Yeah. And, what we know historically is most companies, it's a lot of lip service. Some companies, of course, are actually trying. Some companies not. But what blockchain allows you to do is actually show that you have done something. Show that, that t-shirt was not made with child labor. Show that, that cobalt did not come from, a mine in a country where you're not supposed to be. So I think that, blockchain really opens up the space for this to be a legitimate goal. And to be much more widely publicized in a way that, people aren't questioning like, oh, is that true? Or are they just kind of saying that? So I think that's pretty exciting.
Well, that's interesting. There's a question here that says, can blockchain prevent or reduce counterfeit products? You alluded to provenance, not so much them being counterfeit, but them being not the thing you thought you were going to get, or from the place you thought it was going to come from. But on the question of counterfeiting, again, this is one of those things where I think we come up against some of those limitations that we discussed earlier, right? Which is that how do you create digital traceability for physical goods? How do you know, even though that there is this digital fingerprint, that the goods itself haven't been somehow messed with anyway? Hanu, any thoughts on that?
In fact, there are the various things that could be done. There are some of the high value goods, for example, they are embedding chips in the goods that, that which you can use, which periodically emit signals or you can scan. And then as it goes through the supply chain, and then from where it originated and where it ended, not just through the supply chain, but subsequently once the goods are sold and getting used. Some of the high value goods have started implementing this, these embedded chips. That's one aspect. There are in fact some industries related to farming that are actually creating the DNA analysis of the underlying product. In fact, one of the networks, one of the startups in Canada is using this for cannabis products. They're doing the DNA analysis of them and then storing it in a blockchain, and subsequently wherever the users are buying, then they look at they can look at where it originated from, whether it is a real product, legitimate product, or a counterfeit product. But ultimately, essentially to tie in the physical world to the electronic world, you need to have something which you can trust, right? Which tends to be some technology based, which is usually it's an IoT device, is what some sensors, or in some cases some analysis, chemical analysis of it, and storing that signature of that chemical analysis. So those are some of the ways in which you can tie in the physical and the electronic world to keep then have the blockchain as a trust anchor subsequently.
But I think, even more exciting is, today we're seeing new ways of manufacturing, right? So you think about 3D printing. Blockchain can help you track the IP for your 3D printer, right? So, one of the problems, again, getting to the counterfeit thing is, okay, so I send you, a CAD file and I want you to print 10,000 of these parts for me, and you just go ahead and print 20,000. So that's a violation, right? Those are not going to be legitimate products. So you can go and sell them. So blockchain allows you to, create a workflow whereby you would be able to track that, make sure that there's only 10,000 printed or whatever, and that the payouts were done accordingly. So I think, in addition to thinking about the existing technology and like the problem with fraud, which is a problem in every supply chain, from oil to manufactured goods, everything. There's also new ways of doing it that you have to be able to have systems that interact that way as well.
Right, that makes total sense. We're in our last 5 minutes here. Apologies for the phone ringing. But this seems like a very pertinent question that speaks directly to the scalability of this technology. And unfortunately, it's from an anonymous attendee, and I don't know who this is. So Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous, reveal yourself. No, what will happen with supply chains using many different blockchains? For example, just in food traceability, Oracle, IBM, and a number of other companies have production blockchains. As a downstream consumer of this data, how will the data traverse through these different platforms? Will a consumer need to create interfaces for 20 or 30 different kinds of technology? Who wants to take a crack at that? Because I think that is really fundamental to this whole discussion.
Yeah, I'll probably take a shot at it, and Elisa can add. The fact of the matter is, the question is, very legitimate. That is the current view of the world. That's what is happening. It is increasingly going to happen. So that's why the blockchain interoperability is one of the main topics, both on the architecture, design, and development, and tools and standardization. On all fronts, interoperability of the blockchain is something that is getting tackled. We ourselves have created, make the blockchains interoperable in a variety of ways. Simplest case being, you pull the information from somewhere, send it to the other blockchain is the simplest form of interoperability. Or more complicated interoperability is to transfer assets in atomic manner across the blockchains. We have done, all those kinds of stuff. But that's what is required, which are enabled by the tools. So net is there are going to be different blockchains. There are going to be, many of them are going to be silos and islands. There are certain use cases where you need to perhaps stitch together various networks. Either you hand code them or tool enable them, and the standardization, using standardization is what needs to be done. You can't avoid that at this point of time or in the near future.
Understood. Elisa, anything to add?
Yes, I would add two things. So the first is the consumer should never know a blockchain was used. That shouldn't affect the consumer at all. The second is, just to this point, if you want blockchains to work together, there have to be standard state objects, right? So an invoice in one blockchain has to look exactly like an invoice in another. And right now that is not the case anywhere. But there's a number of different initiatives. Some of them are sector specific, like Mobi, for example, is looking at this, Pizza, both in the mobility space, and DSI, which is just kind of got launched. R3 was a part of that in the beginning, the Digital Standards Initiative, and that looks at standardizing trade state objects. Every single one of the major blockchain platforms are on those. So you have Ethereum, you have Fabric, you have Corda, working together to figure out how we can build our blockchains today to make sure that when interoperability is something that makes sense. I mean, like, it doesn't really make sense right now. The blockchains are too small. The use cases are too small. But when it makes sense that they will be interoperable, you can transfer assets. So I think that that movement is being made within the platform community to make sure that that's going to be a reality.
Is that something that you would like to lead? Would Corda like to be known as a platform which enables interoperability, makes it easier?
I think every platform is going to enable interoperability. We started the Digital Standards Initiative. I mean, it was initially called the Universal Trade Network. Us with Marco Polo recognized that, like, if you're doing cross-border trade, there's never going to be one blockchain. Of course, I think there should be. It should be Corda. But however, there's always going to be a lot of blockchains. They're going to have to work together.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to make sure that we did enable that, and we did lead that initiative in the beginning. Yeah.
You mentioned one, we're almost out of time, but a word came up there, which I think is worth talking a minute about: standards. This is one of those things where, when I first got interested in this, it was looking at Bitcoin. This was before blockchain entered the vernacular. And it's a question of governance was one that was very important. Governed by math alone, I think, has proven to be insufficient. And especially now that we're in this poly blockchain world and different platforms and everything, the idea of a common set of standards and maybe even some lightly organized governance bodies to help address those, I think is very important. Elisa, do you agree? And what's your perspective on that?
Completely agree. Governance is in fact in sort of by the end of 2019 where we saw a lot of the blockchain platforms falling down. Is you need to do governance in a way that makes sense. If there's a problem, there needs to be somebody you can call to fix that problem. And so really we focus very heavily on that, and I think so has the sector. Everybody recognizes that this is really what we need to do going forward, and I think there's a lot of bodies in existence that are moving in that direction and working together.
That's great. It's now 2 o'clock. That is unfortunately the top of the hour, and I know people have to get back to their very busy lives at home doing whatever it is that they're doing. But I'd like to just thank our panelists once again, Elisa and Hanu, for joining us, for sharing their insights. That was a real treat and a sweeping discussion. We covered a lot of really good ground there. We always get requests from people who want to learn more about what you're up to. If you're able to share in the chat where people can reach out to you or your company to find out more, I'm sure everyone would really appreciate that. And to everyone who's joined, do check out the course, do check out the new book, Supply Chain Revolution. You can find out about many of the things we discussed here today and much, much more. It's based on work that we do for our members, which is really, we think, top of the line, deep research, and it's available for everyone to read. So please put it on your reading list for while you're in quarantine. And thank you again for joining us. That concludes the webinar. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon, evening, morning, wherever in the world you are. We appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much.